What would you do if you were stopped by the police? Not for a violation, but simply because of the car you drive. A successful black man faced this shocking reality. With everything on the line, his rights, his dignity, could he prove that his success was earned and not stolen? Watch as the story unfolds on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories. The streets of Chicago sprawled in a familiar, comforting way beneath Nathaniel Carter's wheels as he cruised through the early afternoon. It was one of those rare moments when the sun shone bright against the cold, looming backdrop of the city, casting long shadows across the concrete streets. The city's hustle and bustle were there, but for a few brief moments, Nathaniel was beyond it all, embracing the serenity of his ride, the deep hum of his newly acquired Ferrari V8 engine under his feet. It was a feeling like no other. Nathaniel was 32 years old, but in many ways he had lived through decades of struggles and triumphs. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Chicago, he had learned early that life wouldn't hand him anything without effort. His parents, though loving and supportive, didn't have the financial means to provide him with luxuries. His mother was a schoolteacher, and his father worked as a mechanic. They raised him to understand the value of hard work, of dedication, and of fighting for what you wanted in life. Nathaniel took those lessons to heart, pushing himself relentlessly in school and later in his career in the finance industry. When Nathaniel first entered the finance world, he started at the bottom. He worked in accounting, auditing spreadsheets late into the night while others were out enjoying life. But Nathaniel had a plan. He knew that with enough discipline and determination, he could climb the corporate ladder. Over the years, he did just that, earning a reputation for his sharp mind, excellent work ethic, and ability to close deals that others couldn't. Now, as an executive in a top firm, Nathaniel had secured his place among the city's successful. Still, no matter how high he climbed, Nathaniel never forgot where he came from. He stayed grounded in the values his parents had instilled in him: honesty, integrity, and humility. That was part of why he couldn't help but smile as he shifted gears in his Ferrari, feeling the power surge through his hands. This car was more than just a luxury. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, every late night, every sacrifice, every rejection he had faced on the way up. He had earned it. The Ferrari was sleek and a bold statement. Its deep metallic red paint gleamed under the sun, reflecting the world around it like a mirror. Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as the car smoothly glided down the road, a purring beast that was finally under his control. It wasn't just the car itself. It was everything the car represented: his success, his resilience, and his unyielding drive to prove everyone wrong. It had been a long time coming, but Nathaniel had finally reached a place in life where he could comfortably sit behind the wheel of something like this. And today, he felt invincible. As he continued his drive, Nathaniel's mind wandered to the recent deal he had closed at work. It had been a difficult one, a complicated investment opportunity that had required every ounce of his expertise and negotiation skills. But in the end, it was his to take credit for. Nathaniel had earned the respect of his colleagues, and with this latest deal, he had proven to everyone that he belonged at the top. For once, he wasn't constantly fighting to keep his position. He was securing it. But as Nathaniel steered the car through the smooth curve of the road, something jolted him from his thoughts. A quick flash of blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. It was the familiar, sinking feeling that came with being pulled over by the police. Nathaniel's stomach tightened and his mind immediately raced. What was going on? Was there a reason for this stop? Nathaniel checked his speed. He wasn't speeding. The road was mostly clear, and he hadn't passed any signs warning of speed limits. Everything appeared to be in order, but the flashing lights remained behind him. His anxiety began to build. Though Nathaniel had never been in trouble with the law, there was something about being a black man in a city like Chicago that made every encounter with the police feel more dangerous. It wasn't just the ticket or the fine. It was the fear of how the situation might escalate, of being seen as a suspect just for existing. Nathaniel's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as he slowed the car, easing it to the shoulder of the road. The engine's growl slowly faded, leaving only the buzzing of the police lights and the occasional passing car. The sound of the city around him seemed to blur into a distant hum as his heart raced. His mind was already working overtime, wondering why he had been pulled over. Had someone called it in because of the car? Was this about the Ferrari? As Nathaniel came to a complete stop, he briefly glanced in the rearview mirror at the police car that had pulled in behind him. He could see two officers inside, their faces obscured by the reflective windshield. His breath caught in his throat, and the knot in his stomach grew tighter. He kept his hands firmly on the wheel, making sure they were visible to the officers. He had read somewhere that it was best to keep your hands where they could be seen during a traffic stop, especially when dealing with police. Nathaniel took a slow, steady breath, trying to calm the nerves that had suddenly taken over his body. He had worked so hard to get to this point in life, to prove that he belonged, that he wasn't just a product of his circumstances. But as he sat there, waiting for the officer to approach, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that, in this moment, none of that mattered. All of his hard work, his success, his newfound place in the world, it didn't seem to matter at all when it came to how people saw him. The officer's car door opened, and the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement echoed in Nathaniel's ears. His jaw clenched, but he kept his posture relaxed, trying to maintain his composure. He had learned over the years to control his reactions. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the constant weight of living with the awareness that, no matter how far he had come, he was still seen by some as a threat. Or maybe it was the simple fact that he was finally living his dream, only to have it overshadowed by something as mundane as a traffic stop. As the officer approached, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. The officer's face was still hidden by his mirrored sunglasses, but Nathaniel could see the rigidity of his posture, the way his hand hovered near his gun. It was a gesture that made Nathaniel's chest tighten even more. He tried to ignore the rising tension, but it was impossible to block out. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. Nathaniel had lived through enough experiences to know that sometimes, being black in the wrong place could be more dangerous than anything else. The officer stopped beside the car, and the harsh click of his boots against the pavement echoed like a countdown. Nathaniel knew this was it, the moment of truth. The officer's voice cut through the thick silence. "You know why I pulled you over?" Nathaniel's mind raced, but he forced himself to remain calm to focus. "I'm not sure, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't answer right away, instead peering into the car with an air of suspicion. He studied Nathaniel for a moment before his eyes flicked to the Ferrari, and Nathaniel felt the officer's gaze linger there. The officer's posture didn't shift, but there was something in the way he looked at the car, something that sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. The officer finally spoke again, his tone sharp and dismissive. "That car. It's a little too flashy for someone like you. Step out of the vehicle." The words hit Nathaniel like a slap in the face. His mind raced in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't a simple case of being stopped for speeding or for an expired tag. No, this was about the car. This was about who Nathaniel was, and the assumptions that the officer had already made simply because of the car he drove. But Nathaniel had no choice but to comply. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He opened the door slowly, trying to keep his composure, despite the rising tide of anger and disbelief flooding his mind. This was about more than just a car. It was about his right to exist as a successful black man in a world that didn't always see him as such. As he stepped out of the car, he kept his back straight, his posture as steady as he could make it. The sun, which had seemed so bright only moments ago, now felt unbearably hot on his neck. But he couldn't let that show. He wouldn't give the officer that satisfaction. He faced the officer and tried to steady his breathing. "I have all the paperwork, officer. This is my car." "I can show you the documents," Nathaniel said, his voice surprisingly calm. But as he spoke, he felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders, the pressure of years of systemic injustice and generational prejudice. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a reminder of the obstacles he still faced, even in a city that he had worked so hard to make his own. He wasn't just being stopped. He was being targeted. And no matter how hard he fought, it seemed like that was something he could never escape. The sun hung high over the streets of Chicago as Nathaniel Carter cruised down the road in his newly acquired Ferrari. It was a bright, calm afternoon, and everything felt right as he drove, his fingers wrapped comfortably around the wheel. The roar of the V8 engine beneath him was satisfying, like a musical note of accomplishment, every rev echoing the success he'd worked tirelessly to achieve. This car, this moment, it was a culmination of years of sacrifice, late nights, and endless effort in the finance world. He had earned it, and it felt good. Nathaniel's thoughts drifted for a moment, reminiscing on how far he had come. From a young man growing up in a modest neighborhood, where the only option was to push forward against the odds, to now, a respected executive with financial stability and the freedom to live on his own terms. The Ferrari wasn't just a luxury. It was a symbol, a reward for his hard work. He had earned the right to drive it. But then, just as he reached a calm, serene stretch of road, a flash of blue and red lights reflected off the rearview mirror. His pulse quickened as he checked his speed. There were no signs of violation. He was within the speed limit. Yet the police lights remained flashing behind him. Nathaniel's heart sank into his stomach, the familiar unease creeping up his spine. He had no idea why he was being pulled over, but something about the whole situation felt off. Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel guided the Ferrari to the side of the road and came to a slow stop. He felt the weight of the moment settle on him. It was a regular traffic stop, but somehow it didn't feel routine. As he sat in the car, he couldn't help but notice that this wasn't just about a violation. It was something more, something beyond the traffic laws. As a black man in a high-end car, he was already aware of the perception people might have, judgments based solely on his appearance and the vehicle he drove. The police cruiser stopped behind him. Nathaniel's grip tightened on the wheel, but he forced himself to relax. He knew the importance of staying calm, of not letting the anxiety take control. He kept his hands visible, rested on the steering wheel, just as he'd been taught in any traffic stop. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, briefly catching sight of the officer stepping out of the vehicle. The officer was a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair tied back in a neat ponytail. Her uniform was crisp and pristine, her badge gleaming in the sunlight. She approached the car with purpose, her footsteps steady. Nathaniel's stomach twisted into a knot. He didn't know what to expect, but he could already sense the tension. He had been in enough situations to know when something was about to go wrong. She stopped at the driver's side window and looked down at Nathaniel. Her eyes flickered over him quickly before she spoke, her voice clear and professional, though there was an edge to it. "You know why I pulled you over?" she asked, her gaze never leaving him. Nathaniel blinked. "No, officer, I haven't broken any traffic laws," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he felt a flutter of unease rising in his chest. The officer didn't immediately respond. Her gaze shifted toward the Ferrari, and she looked at the car with a look of suspicion. There was something in her eyes, something that made Nathaniel's heart beat a little faster. "That car," she said, her voice dipping as she gestured toward the sleek red Ferrari, "it's a bit too flashy for someone like you, don't you think?" The words stung more than Nathaniel had expected. He had heard it all before, the side glances, the quiet judgments people made when they saw him, a black man in an expensive car. But hearing it so bluntly, said so openly, left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was a statement that went beyond the car itself. It felt personal. His success, his hard-earned luxury, was being questioned just because of the color of his skin. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "This is my car, officer. I purchased it legally, and I have all the paperwork to prove it." His hands moved slowly toward the glove compartment, the routine of proving himself almost automatic at this point. He had been down this road before in different ways, but the sting of discrimination was always there, lurking beneath the surface. Officer Harris didn't seem to be listening. She continued to eye the car as if trying to find something wrong with it, something that would justify her suspicion. Nathaniel could feel her gaze on him, sizing him up, not just as a man in a car, but as someone who didn't belong in the world he had created for himself. It was as if his success was an anomaly in her eyes. Her lips pressed together in a tight line and she crossed her arms over her chest, eyes still locked on the Ferrari. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," she said flatly, the command ringing in the air. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't expect this to escalate, but he wasn't going to argue. He had learned over the years to pick his battles carefully. He opened the door slowly, his movements deliberate. He knew this wasn't just about proving the car was his. It was about proving his right to exist in the space he had worked so hard to carve out for himself. He stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze on him as he did. Her eyes didn't soften, nor did she show any indication of understanding. She still viewed him as suspicious, as someone who didn't fit the image she had in mind. The sun felt hotter as Nathaniel closed the door behind him, his hands still steady at his sides. He could feel the air pressing in around him, the tension rising, but he refused to let it get to him. "I have all the paperwork, officer," he said, trying to maintain control, trying to keep his voice calm and collected. "I have proof of purchase, loan documents, and everything you need to verify the legitimacy of this car." He didn't want to have to explain himself, but he knew how this game worked. She glanced down at the paperwork as though looking for an excuse not to accept it. "I'll need to take a closer look," she said, not meeting his eyes. It was as though the papers weren't enough, as though they were just a formality in her eyes. There was no recognition of the legitimacy of his ownership, only continued suspicion. Nathaniel's frustration began to build. He had done everything right. He had worked hard, paid his dues, and earned every inch of the success he had. Yet here he was, treated like a suspect because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. He felt the weight of every moment he had spent striving to prove himself. All the times people had doubted him simply because of who he was, all condensed into this one interaction. Finally, Officer Harris turned away, walking back toward her patrol car without another word, leaving Nathaniel standing there, his nerves taut with tension. He stood quietly, hands still at his sides, trying to maintain his composure, but his mind was racing. The officers had no reason to doubt him, no reason to assume he was anything other than what he claimed. But it didn't matter. He wasn't just being questioned about a car. He was being questioned about his very right to occupy the same spaces as others. As he waited for the officer to return, he couldn't help but think about all the times he had proven himself, whether it was in the boardroom with clients or even in simple interactions with strangers. But this moment, standing on the side of the road, being treated like a criminal for owning a car he had worked for, felt different. It was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there would always be someone who saw him as less than. Nathaniel stood silently, his hands still at his sides, the oppressive heat of the Chicago afternoon pressing down on him as he waited for Officer Harris to return. The steady hum of his Ferrari's engine idled in the background, a constant reminder of what had brought him here in the first place, a symbol of his success, of all the years spent climbing the ladder in the corporate world. He had worked tirelessly to earn the respect and the wealth he now had, and yet here he was, being treated like a suspect, being questioned about the legitimacy of the car he had legally purchased. When Officer Harris returned, Nathaniel's gut twisted. She wasn't alone. A man much older had joined her, Officer Mitchell. His presence seemed to shift the atmosphere even further, the air thickening with tension. Officer Mitchell was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a hardened expression. His uniform was crisply pressed, and his face bore a certain level of authority. But there was something in his eyes, a coldness, a dismissiveness, that immediately made Nathaniel uneasy. Officer Harris nodded toward him as if seeking his approval or guidance, and the older officer's gaze fell on Nathaniel, lingering there as if inspecting him under a microscope. Nathaniel couldn't help but feel the sharpness of that look, the way Mitchell seemed to judge him before even hearing a word out of his mouth. As if his mere presence, his appearance, his blackness, was enough to raise suspicion. "What's going on here?" Officer Mitchell's voice rumbled, his tone sharp, authoritative, and condescending. It wasn't a question born out of genuine curiosity. It was a demand for answers, an interrogation without cause. "His car doesn't seem to fit the profile of someone like him," Officer Harris replied, her voice tight with skepticism. "I'm not convinced he can afford it. It's too flashy, too expensive." Nathaniel's pulse quickened at her words, but he refused to let his emotions get the best of him. This wasn't the first time he had encountered such thinly veiled racism, but every time it happened, it still stung. He could feel the weight of their judgments bearing down on him, as though his success was something to be questioned simply because of who he was. "Let me see the documents," Officer Mitchell said abruptly, extending his hand to Nathaniel, a silent command. His eyes remained fixed on Nathaniel, as though expecting him to somehow fail the test. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He pulled out the envelope again, handing over the same set of documents he had already shown to Officer Harris: proof of purchase, the loan agreement, insurance papers, and his driver's license. This time, he felt a bit of the frustration boiling over, but he kept it contained. He had done everything by the book. What else did they want from him? Mitchell took the papers from Nathaniel, his movements slow and deliberate as he flipped through the stack, his eyes scanning each page with an air of disbelief. Nathaniel could feel the officer's eyes on him, scrutinizing every detail as though looking for something, anything, that would allow him to invalidate the legitimacy of the documents. After a long, drawn-out silence, Officer Mitchell scoffed. He looked up at Nathaniel with a sneer, the judgment in his eyes all too clear. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, his tone dripping with skepticism. "I don't buy it." Nathaniel's throat tightened. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he had to keep calm. It was obvious that these officers weren't looking for a reason to believe him. They were looking for a reason to discredit him, to assert that someone like him couldn't possibly own something so expensive. This wasn't about the car. This was about him, about the way they saw him. "I've shown you everything," Nathaniel said, his voice firm but controlled. "Everything is in order. This is my car. I'm not some criminal, and I'm not lying to you." Officer Harris shot a glance at Mitchell, her face set with uncertainty, but the older officer's expression was unwavering. He wasn't about to let Nathaniel's protests change his mind. "Look, this car's way out of your price range," Officer Mitchell said, his voice cold. "I don't care what papers you've got. You're not driving this car legally. We're going to have to impound it." The words hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. Impound it. How could they even think of doing that when he had done nothing wrong? But as the words sank in, the realization of what was happening washed over him. This wasn't about a legal mistake. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about their belief that he, as a black man, didn't deserve to own a car like that. Their preconceived notions, their biases, were shaping their actions, and Nathaniel could feel the weight of racial prejudice pressing down on him harder than ever. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. What was the point of arguing? They had already made up their minds. They weren't interested in hearing his side. They had already decided that someone like him couldn't possibly afford something like a Ferrari. And that, above all else, was the most infuriating part. "No," Nathaniel said, his voice low but filled with defiance. "I've worked too hard for this. You can't take my car. I'm not going to let you just strip me of what I've earned." Officer Harris glanced at Mitchell, uncertainty flickering across her face, but he remained resolute. "You're making a mistake," Nathaniel added, his voice rising slightly. "This is my property and I'm not breaking any laws." Mitchell's expression hardened and he stepped closer, towering over Nathaniel. "You don't get to decide what's a mistake here." "We do," he said, his words laced with finality. "The car's being impounded." Nathaniel felt a surge of frustration, but more than that, there was a heavy sadness that settled in his chest. He had fought so hard to get to where he was, to prove himself in a world that often didn't want him to succeed. And here he was, being told that all of that didn't matter, that his success was only valid if it fit into the narrow mold others expected of him. This was more than just a traffic stop. This was the continuation of a lifelong struggle, a struggle that Nathaniel had hoped he could escape with hard work and perseverance. But no matter how far he went, how successful he became, it felt like he would always be seen through the lens of racial prejudice. As Officer Mitchell turned to walk back toward the patrol car, Nathaniel stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the injustice washing over him. His mind raced with questions. How could this be happening? What had he done wrong? But deep down, he knew the answer. He hadn't done anything wrong. The problem was that they had judged him before even giving him a chance. They had seen the car, seen him, and made assumptions based on his appearance, his blackness, rather than the facts in front of them. "This isn't over," Nathaniel muttered to himself, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He wasn't going to let them take away what he had worked so hard for. But as the officers began to discuss the impound process, Nathaniel knew that he would have to fight harder than ever to prove that his success was his own, that he deserved to be in this moment just as much as anyone else. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists as the realization of what was happening fully set in. He had worked tirelessly for this moment, fought to break free from every limitation society had placed on him, and now, in a single breath, it felt like all of it was being taken from him. He could feel his pulse thundering in his chest, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he wasn't about to let his emotions get the best of him. Not now. Not when it felt like everything was on the line. With a deep breath, Nathaniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope containing all the documents, proof of purchase, the loan agreement, the insurance papers, and his driver's license. He had already given these documents to Officer Harris, but it didn't matter. She hadn't seemed to listen, had barely looked at the papers before dismissing them as inconsequential. Officer Mitchell, on the other hand, hadn't even bothered to glance at them yet, instead focusing entirely on questioning his right to own a luxury car. As he handed the envelope over to Officer Mitchell again, his fingers were steady, but his mind was racing. He knew that his situation wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about something far more significant: his dignity, his right to exist without being judged solely by the color of his skin, and the success he had achieved. The officers weren't interested in facts. They weren't interested in logic or reason. They were interested in tearing down everything Nathaniel had built simply because he didn't fit their narrow idea of who was worthy of driving a car like this. "I've already given you these documents," Nathaniel said, his voice firm, "and I'm giving them to you again, just to make sure you don't miss anything this time. This is my car and I can prove it." Officer Mitchell, who had taken the documents without a word, flipped through them with deliberate slowness, his eyes skimming each page as if looking for some flaw, some excuse to disregard Nathaniel's ownership. But with each passing second, it became more and more obvious that Mitchell wasn't reading the documents for accuracy. He was reading them with the sole intention of finding something that didn't fit his assumptions. He was looking for a way to dismiss Nathaniel, a way to undermine him. As Mitchell flipped through the papers, Nathaniel couldn't help but notice the man's demeanor. His frown deepened with every page, his eyes narrowing as if he expected to see something that would confirm his doubts. When he finally looked up at Nathaniel, the expression on his face was one of disdain, mixed with something darker, something far too familiar. "This doesn't make sense," Mitchell muttered, his voice low and skeptical. "This car is way out of your price range. There's no way someone like you could afford this." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat at the words. He had heard it all before: the whispers, the stares, the microaggressions that chipped away at his spirit over the years. But to hear it so plainly, so openly from a law enforcement officer, made his blood boil. The implication was clear: because he was black, because he didn't fit the mold of what people thought a successful person should look like, his achievements weren't valid. His hard work didn't count. His success didn't deserve to be celebrated. Instead, it was treated with suspicion and hostility. Mitchell's eyes flicked back to the Ferrari as he stood tall in front of Nathaniel, his tone dripping with judgment. "That car is too flashy for someone like you," he said, a hint of mockery in his voice. "It doesn't belong here." Nathaniel's chest tightened at the words, but he refused to let them rattle him. He had fought too hard, come too far, to let someone like Officer Mitchell strip him of his dignity. He had earned the right to drive this car. He had earned the right to stand here, unapologetic and proud of his success. "Are you seriously going to tell me that because of the car I drive, I don't belong here?" Nathaniel's voice was calm, but the intensity behind it was undeniable. "I've worked my ass off to get here. I've made sacrifices that most people would never understand, and I'm not going to let you tear that down just because you don't think I deserve it." For a brief moment, it seemed like Officer Mitchell was about to retort. His lips tightened, his brow furrowed in frustration. But before he could speak, Officer Harris stepped forward, her expression softer than before. She had been quiet during the exchange, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes flicking between Nathaniel and Mitchell. But now, as the situation escalated, there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. Her stance loosened just slightly, and for the first time she glanced at Nathaniel with a hint of empathy. "Mitchell, maybe we should just take a step back," she said, her voice quieter, less certain than before. "He's shown us the papers. He has every right to be driving this car." Mitchell looked at her, his face contorting with irritation, but he didn't respond immediately. It was clear that Harris's voice had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, but it wasn't enough to sway his rigid beliefs. His gaze flicked from Harris back to Nathaniel, his mouth set in a grim line as if unwilling to accept what was in front of him. "No," Mitchell snapped after a long, tense silence. "I'm not convinced. The fact is, this car is too much for him, and I don't believe these documents are real." We're impounding it. Nathaniel's stomach churned at the words. He had expected it. He had known that this battle would not be easy, that it wouldn't end with the officers just walking away and admitting their mistake. But hearing it aloud, hearing the blatant refusal to acknowledge his ownership, hit him harder than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about a system that continually questioned his right to exist on equal footing with everyone else. "I'm not going to let you take it," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering, his resolve hardening with each word. "You can't just take what I've worked for. You can't strip me of my dignity like this. I'm not some criminal, and I'm not going to let you treat me like one." Mitchell took a step forward, his eyes narrowing in frustration. "We'll see about that. You think you're above the law. You think because you've got a fancy car you're untouchable. Well, I'm telling you now, that's not how it works." But Nathaniel stood his ground. He could feel the weight of the years of hard work, the years of pushing through adversity, the years of fighting against the assumptions and stereotypes. His heart raced, but it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else, something deeper. It was a determination to make sure that no one could ever take away what he had earned, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, didn't deserve what they had fought for. "I've earned everything I have," Nathaniel said, his voice stronger than ever. "And I'm not going to let anyone take that from me. Not you, not anyone." Officer Harris, who had been watching the exchange carefully, finally spoke again, her voice tentative. "Maybe we should get a supervisor involved, Mitchell. This doesn't feel right." Mitchell's face twisted in anger, but for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Harris's words had planted a seed of doubt, and even though Mitchell was reluctant to admit it, he could feel the tension in the air. Nathaniel had stood his ground, refused to let them push him around, and that small act of defiance had shaken them both. The road ahead was uncertain, but Nathaniel knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to back down. As the officers hesitated, the weight of the moment felt like a turning point. Nathaniel knew that he was fighting not just for his car, but for his right to be treated as an equal, for his right to stand tall in a world that so often wanted to keep him down. He wouldn't let them take that away from him. The sun seemed to hang heavier in the sky as the tense standoff between Nathaniel and the two officers continued. His heart was still racing, but the anger that had surged through him earlier had shifted into a cold, unwavering determination. He had given them everything they needed to prove his ownership, everything he had worked for. But it wasn't enough. It never seemed to be enough. Officer Mitchell was still determined to take his car, to strip him of the success he had fought so hard for. And Officer Harris stood silently, unsure of how to intervene, as if caught between her conscience and the pressure of her partner's actions. For a brief moment, Nathaniel stood there, trying to steady his breathing, the weight of it all pushing down on him. His hands were still clenched at his sides, the frustration and helplessness threatening to overwhelm him. The officers were still discussing the next steps in the process of impounding his car, their words indistinguishable but full of finality. But just as Nathaniel felt like this fight was slipping through his fingers, something changed. A voice, deep and familiar, cut through the tension. "That's not what happened, Mitchell," the voice called, strong and assertive, unmistakably certain. "This man owns that car. I've seen him drive it." The officers turned toward the voice, and Nathaniel's gaze followed. Standing at the edge of the scene was a man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, Isaiah Wells. Nathaniel recognized him immediately. Isaiah was an older gentleman, a long-time resident who had seen Nathaniel's rise to success, someone who had watched him grow up and always made a point to greet him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Isaiah knew Nathaniel well, knew his character, knew his hard work, knew that he had earned everything he had. And now, Isaiah was stepping forward, his presence a silent statement of support. Isaiah's weathered face was set in a firm expression, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the officers. His voice was steady, unwavering as he walked toward the scene. "I've known Nathaniel for years," Isaiah continued, his voice calm but filled with authority. "He worked hard to get where he is. I can vouch for him. This car, it's his. He bought it legally and he has no criminal record. He's one of the most upstanding men I know. I don't know what's going on here, but you're making a mistake." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the witness. Mitchell's expression faltered for a moment, and Nathaniel could see the uncertainty creeping into his hardened features. Officer Harris, who had been silently observing up to this point, looked to Mitchell, then back to Isaiah, a subtle change in her posture as if reconsidering the situation. Isaiah's words hung in the air, the weight of his testimony forcing the officers to pause, to take a step back. There was no longer any excuse for them to keep questioning Nathaniel's right to own the car. The presence of a witness, someone who knew Nathaniel personally and could vouch for his integrity, was undeniable. Officer Mitchell's shoulders slumped slightly as he finally dropped his gaze to the ground. The stoic, unyielding figure he had projected earlier seemed to waver, his resolve cracking in the face of undeniable truth. He looked back up at Nathaniel, his expression now a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance. I see," Mitchell muttered, the words barely above a whisper, his voice carrying the weight of his reluctance. "I made a mistake." Nathaniel stood still, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and relief, but he didn't respond immediately. He had been ready to fight this fight to the end, but now that the truth was finally coming to light, there was something bitter about the way the officers were retracting their stance. Mitchell's apology, though grudging, felt hollow. It was the kind of apology that came only when the truth had been forced upon him, an apology not born of genuine remorse but of the realization that he had been wrong. Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably beside Mitchell. She glanced at Nathaniel for a moment and then back down at the ground. I apologize," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. "We should have trusted you. This shouldn't have gone this far." Nathaniel took a slow breath, but he wasn't sure if the apology was enough. He had been forced to defend his rights, to prove something he shouldn't have had to prove in the first place. The apology felt like too little too late, an empty gesture after a situation that should never have happened. No amount of words could undo the harm that had already been done. "I'm glad you see the truth now," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. "But you have to understand this isn't just about this car. It's about the way I've been treated, the way people like me are treated just because of who we are. You don't get to decide who belongs in this world, who deserves success, just by looking at them." His words hung in the air, and for a moment neither officer said anything. Mitchell's face reddened slightly, and Harris looked away, clearly uncomfortable. They had been called out, forced to confront their biases and the systemic racism that had been ingrained in their actions. But despite their apologies, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that their minds had already been made up long before they pulled him over. The bias was deep, and it wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words. Nathaniel turned his back to them, not bothering to wait for another apology, not caring to hear another excuse. This was his moment, not to bask in the acknowledgement of his right to own a car, but to reclaim his sense of self, his dignity, and his place in the world. He wasn't going to let this encounter define him. He walked back to his Ferrari, the engine still idling, waiting for him. Nathaniel slid into the driver's seat, the familiar sensation of the leather under his fingertips, a small comfort in the face of everything he had just experienced. The weight of the moment lingered in his chest, but his resolve had never been clearer. He started the car and pressed the accelerator gently. As the engine roared to life and the car began to move, Nathaniel felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't going to be held back. Not by the officer's biases, not by society's assumptions, and certainly not by anyone who tried to tell him he didn't belong. As he merged back onto the road, Nathaniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of determination. He had made it this far by refusing to let anything or anyone define him. And now, nothing would hold him back from the journey ahead. He drove on, the city of Chicago unfolding before him, his mind clear, his heart resolute. He wasn't just driving away from the officers. He was driving away from every barrier, every challenge, and every moment of prejudice that had ever stood in his way. The road ahead was his, and no one would take that from him.